I've yet to play a tiny epic game that I didn't like, but I've also yet to play a tiny epic game that didn't feel like sacrifices were made in order to make it tiny and epic. Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. and today I'm reviewing Tiny Epic Dungeons and, well, minorly Tiny Epic Dungeons: The Stories expansion and also the Potions and Perils expansion, the whole 9 yards of what this game contains. This is Tiny Epic Dungeons. It is the latest, although shortly not to be the latest, but currently the latest version of a Tiny Epic game. This is a long line of games from Gamelin Games, designed by Scott Almes, all of them being tiny and epic and giving a different theme to them. The one that's coming up most shortly, or possibly already live by the time you watch this video, is Tiny Epic Vikings, but that's not about that. It's about this, Tiny Epic Dungeons. As you might imagine, this is a dungeon crawler that is focusing heavily on the tiny epic aspect, and this is the first time they've had miniatures in the game. Usually they have little meeples, now they have tiny epic miniatures, which should be its own little line of thing, but that's a separate story entirely. This is a dungeon crawler. That's the general idea. Everything else is just a conversation of how this dungeon crawler operates in comparison to other dungeon crawlers. You're going to have your deck of cards. You're going to have a 7x7 grid, a starting little floor, a dungeon entrance tile, and then you're going to wander from there around the dungeon. Every time you move around the dungeon, you're going to go ahead and use your movement points every round to go ahead and flip these tiles over, perhaps encountering dead ends, perhaps encountering new little spots where you'll have to put out a new card that should go face down over there, and you're going to be taking whatever actions on that tile. That can involve adding goblins to the dungeon, where you'll draw a card from the goblin deck. You'll associate that card with one of these goblins over here. So, for example, this one over here will go ahead and pop on that spot. My hero over there will lose a single health if I knock him down a health because of the location over there, and then you'll proceed to take any actions. Every single turn on your turn, you have a movement action, any free actions, and then a single heroic action. Your movement is going to be whatever your movement stat is, 3 or 4 for these two characters over here, and then various gear and stuff can modify that movement. Then you'll have any number of free actions. Free actions are anything that shows up in this little orange-yellowish color over there that defines what the cost is, what you're paying, what you're getting out of it. And then you can take a single heroic action, which is the same general symbol, just in blue this time, and you can take one of those a turn. Those can involve anything from resting, where you'll recover health and energy, to taking any of the actions on the various tiles, to often utilizing any of your weapons to attack the various enemies you're fighting off, the monsters and the goblins. And that's basically the turn structure. You're going to take a turn, you're going to take your movement, your heroic action, and your free actions, then you're going to move this torch down the dungeon track, and you want to be mindful there, because if that hits the end, that is one of the ways that you'll lose the game. That, and having the dungeon confound itself into a little impenetrable maze where you cannot find any exit, although that could just be a question of bad luck. But either way, you'll go ahead and move the torch down. If the torch hits a goblin spawn zone, or alternatively a goblin enemy activation mode, then you'll go ahead and spawn a goblin on the entrance tile, perhaps, or alternatively, if it hits that little enemy activation, then all enemies that are currently on the board will activate, using their activation ability to go ahead and possibly move, to attack you, to do different effects to you, depending on what they are. Goblins tend to represent small and little nuances. You can take care of them, but they will cost you time, energy, your time and attention, basically, in the game. Then you have these larger beasts over here that, depending on the player count, you basically have one per player. So you'll have these little cards that you'll be pulling out as you wander deeper into the dungeon, and these will give you specific beasts that you're trying to face off, specific cards that give you, slightly higher health over here. All goblins have 1 health, so they're fairly easy to kill. Like I said, they're nuisances. They're easy enough to manage, but they do take time and energy. And then actual energy too sometimes. Then you'll have the other encounters you'll have. These are harder to kill enemies. This over here has 8 health, that skeleton. That's going to take a lot more energy and focus to take it down. You're going to have to attack it multiple times. You're going to be rolling dice. There's going to be a lot of skill tests in this game. We haven't really touched upon it yet, but you'll frequently be rolling dice based on your stats over here. Your characters have their stats, your strength, your agility, and your intellect, and you'll be rolling dice against those stats, to rolling 1, 2, or 3 dice depending on how good you are, and then using this little system to see if you pass a check. So for example, this action over here involves doing a search action using your intellect, and you have to hit at least 5. If you pass, you'll get 2 energy and draw a spell. If you fail, the torch will move 1 down the track. You're running more out of time. So over here, if we did that, if the wizard, if Jaren the Blue over there, or Garen the Blue, I imagine Jaren the Blue, but I'm not actually certain, but Garen the Blue over there, when he rolls his intellect, if he rolls this over here, you can only ever use 1 die unless that die has pluses on it. So for example, if I rolled, let's just use let's say 3, let's find a 3 over here. If I roll a 3, 4, and a 2 over there, the 4 and the 3 are both not enough, and you can't add them together. I can't get that 5 that I need. The good news is I can go ahead and add the 2 to the 4, and I can use that together to get 6, which is great, and then I get whatever is left on the remaining dice. Any dice you don't use towards the skill test, you'll get energy or health for those dice. So that's going to give you a lot of extra not resources, well, resources, health and energy back from taking skill tests. So taking a skill test generally is a good thing, assuming you're not worried about the consequences. And not all skill tests have negative consequences attached to them. So you're basically wandering around this dungeon, you're encountering goblins, you're encountering traps. There'll be a lot of traps. We have instantaneous effects. Let's see if I can find one over here. You'll have instantaneous effects. Here we go. A little trap, little saw blades, where you have to immediately roll any stat and get at least a 6. If you fail, you lose 3 health. If you succeed, you have the opportunity to take a heroic action using your strength, where you have to hit at least 5, and if you succeed, you'll be able to draw an item or a spell, and then you'll put this on top of the trap, so you don't have to activate it in the future. Because if you don't deal with the trap, then you do have to deal with it in the future. You're going to go around the dungeon until eventually you've hit the enemies you have to take out, which the goblins and nuisances. You have to take out all the encounters you actually have to deal with, and then from there you can wander into the boss's lair, where you'll enter phase 2. This is a game that plays out in 2 phases. Phase 1 is just wandering around the dungeon, trying to take out the encounters, the enemies you have to fight, and trying to find the boss's lair, the entrance to the boss's lair. In phase 2, you're going to flip the boss, and you don't actually know what you're facing until this point. You'll flip the boss, and you'll see what boss you're facing, and you'll have to face off against that enemy. Now, the bosses have a health track that will be basically the number of players times their health track, so 8 health times 2 in this case, because I've set up for 2 players over here, and then you have to reduce that boss to 0, and there is a but here, because you will have to wander around trying to collect these to basically weaken the boss's shields. These over here need to be placed on the boss's track, and until you do, you can't hit past those barriers. So bosses are both something that have a lot more health to deal with, but they also have to be led around the dungeon to both the entrance room, alternatively the various encounters you have on the board, in order to basically get those zones cleared so you can first grab those tokens, consider them a shield wall around the boss, and you can have to taunt them around. Now, bosses do have a taunt action where you can pull the boss over here. If we flip the card over here, the act card, you'll see the action to taunt the boss, pulling around the dungeon. But again, that costs energy, it costs time, it costs attention, but you'll have to go ahead and do that to eventually take down the boss before you run out of time as adventurers. That's basically what's going on here. A few other small notes is we have our spell tracks over here. Any player could use spells, but obviously more wizard-like folk are going to be better at them in terms of rolling their intellect to try to deal with them, to use them. You'll have your gear tracks over here, which your gear both gives you general benefits, but also there are sets of gear. There is the panther, the lion, the bear. There's all these different sets of gear you have that if you get more sets of those gear, you'll be more efficient. You'll get additional perks. So over here I have the longbow of the panther, which means if I can pick up that claw of the panther, I'll go ahead and drop that sunhammer. I only have 2 spots for those hand gears over there. And now, because I have a set of 2, whenever I take a ranged action, which is great for win over here, whenever I take a ranged action, I'll get +1 to that die result. Rinse and repeat, go around the dungeon, explore, find things, deal with traps, deal with goblins, deal with the larger enemies, and eventually go ahead into Act 2, where you have to take down the boss while still dealing with the other little goblins that are wandering around the dungeon trying to attack you, and that is Tiny Epic Dungeons. So, what do I think about this game? Let's start with ease of play. Ease of play. Rules are actually fairly obtuse to get through considering how complicated this game is, or more specifically how not complicated this game is, but the rules are a lot to get through. There's a lot of stuff. I did not find the rulebook clear at all, and it's made worse by the iconography. The iconography in this game is straight out terrible. I don't have any ideas of how to make it better necessarily, but I feel the iconography is hard to get through. It's something you will pick it up as you continue to dive into it, but you are constantly referencing the back of these heroes to see exactly what these icons mean, and even when referencing them, and even when using the rulebook, there's some where it's like just a question mark of, well, how exactly do I use that? I'm rolling this, and if I successfully get this, then I can then do another skill test, but I have to use another skill test. I'm using my ranged ability, which means I'm using my agility. There's a whole bunch of stuff as far as trying to figure out the exact way, and then it gets confusing because sometimes you have ranged attacks that use your attack ability, that your might staff. Sometimes you have might attacks that use your agility. There's a whole bunch of just stuff going on in this game that makes it not the most obvious, not the clearest in order to pick up the iconography. You could get it, it's not the end of the world, but it'll take you a play or two before you're not constantly referencing the rules and or the back of these sheets to figure out what's going on. So complicated for what is otherwise supposed to be an accessible game. As far as playtime and table size is fairly reasonable. This is Tiny Epic. Even once it gets out of the box, it takes up a decent amount of table size, but less so than compared to any other dungeon crawler you'll play. And as far as playtime, I would say generally around an hour. This is not a game that's that quick. It is a little tedious to get through both this. The setup's not that long, but going through the motions, going through the Act 2, and let's not even talk about stories where you have the opportunity to go through a 3-level dungeon, but you're looking at generally an hour plus for this game. It's possible to get it done faster than that, but I think you'd have to be rushing it. As far as player count, this is a 1 to 4 player game. I have so far played this solo and 2 players. A note about solo, you're playing it controlling 2 heroes. You always control a minimum of 2 heroes, but you could play it solo controlling both. It's easy enough. I've played it both solo and 2 player. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking, this is a decent dungeon crawler considering the size and price point of it. There's a lot of the classic things you expect from Dungeon Crawler. There is that sense of exploration. There is that sense of gear, of upgrading. There are powers and abilities, mostly in the form of spells, but also your characters have their own unique powers and their own unique stats as far as how they operate, their own little side things that they can do that others can't, and so that gives you a fun little twist. You also have these starting options over here until you cover them up with gear that you gather, and gathering the gear is one of the most fun parts of the game. And while you can't trade gear, you could drop at any point, and the options to pick up dropped gear are often more frequent and more available than the options to grab new gear. So it makes it easier to not really trade, but kind of swap gear in a manner of speaking. The game breaks itself into the 2 acts, giving yourself that Act 1 and the Act 2. The Act 1 is more of a sense of exploration, and the Act 2 is more of the culmination. You found the boss, you're doing what you need to do, you need to take it out, and the variety in the bosses, there's a lot of variety over here. There's all these different cards over here, the different boss cards, all of them giving you different options. There's 2 of them from the Potions of Spell expansion mixed in here, just for the record. But then you have the hero variety, a lot of different ways to go through it. The goblin variety is a little bit on the light end, but all the other varieties are there. The enemies, the bosses, the monsters, the goblins are the ones that I feel could use a bit more. But this general sense of all those things you expect out of a dungeon crawler are there. The gear collecting is easily my favorite part. Trying to gather sets of gear, getting the extra perks, the better stats, the better abilities. That first time you try to take down a goblin and you find yourself using your basic bow, which means you're firing at a range 2, but you also subtract 1 from the result. It feels weak, which means getting that longbow of the Panther, on the other hand, where I now can shoot at a range of 4, and I don't get any penalties, that feels a lot stronger, especially once I start powering it up by gathering more sets of gear from the Panther set. So it has all the dungeon crawler stuff in a very cheap, very accessible box size, and that's mostly where the stuff I like ends. The stuff I don't like are all... I'm going to go through a bunch of things I don't like. And they are a bunch of things. Don't let that take away from anything until we get to the final thoughts element. Most of these critiques do come from the nature of trying to put a game like Sword and Sorcery into a box the size of this. They are natural consequences of what you're trying to do with the dungeon crawler genre. So while they are critiques with the grain of salt of this is the box size you're getting this in. So, first of all, variability could be better. While there are a lot of monsters and there are a lot of heroes, I wish they felt more different. Now, the monsters do feel different enough. I should take that back. Monsters feel decently different. I feel they could be more different, but fine. They have enough difference, so I won't give them too much of a hard time there. The goblins, very minimal difference at all, especially considering you're mostly killing them most of the time pretty quickly. I don't know, I can't speak for other people. Most of the time, we were just killing the goblins fairly quickly, fairly easily, which meant we didn't have to worry about anything other than the fact that, hey, you're alive and you have 1 health, and now you're dead. Bye-bye, see you later. And so the monsters had a little bit of variability, but again, not much. It mostly comes down to a few health differences, not much in terms of abilities, and so the monster variability, again, felt lacking. And then hero variability, while they have different stats, they don't feel that different. I like having them. I like having the variability from the heroes, but I mean, sure, this guy can stealth pass and this guy can use a magic arrow, and they have different amounts of health and energy. It's not that significant. Now, don't get me wrong, I've played other games that are larger games that don't have that much variability. I'm looking at you, Arcadia Quest, but still, I feel there could have been more variability in this over here. There's low variability on most of the experience. Most of the time, you're wandering through the dungeon and just engaging with whatever skill check you have to do, and then go on to the next thing, skill check, next thing, skill check, next thing. I'm sure you can pick other dungeon crawlers and reduce it to a few sentences, but this one felt less variable than most dungeon crawlers I have played. And so in general, just the variability across the board is lacking. I also didn't love the dragging the bosses to these sigils. These sigils over here that you're trying to collect in order to take down the boss, it felt almost like the game had turned into a bit of a pick up and deliver. It's like, hey boss, I know we have this cool gear that we can take you out and start dealing damage to you, but no, we have to spend a little bit of energy and just slowly drag you around the dungeon. It works from a game construct point. The game is not overly easy. The game's reasonable in terms of its difficulty, but it works because it kind of forces you to continue to engage with the dungeon in the second half, and instead of just being a back and forth with the boss where you attack me, I attack you, you attack me, it does force it to be a bit more strategy, but it feels I almost wish the boss had like different stages and it popped up across the board, so as you hit it down, like maybe every time you hit one of these it popped up somewhere else. The nature of trying to drag it around the board just felt like a tedious, almost like a pick up and deliver shoved into your dungeon crawler in order to make that final boss showdown a little less, boring. The iconography, I already touched upon. It's absolutely terrible. It really gets in the way of what should otherwise be a very, very clean and easy experience. And speaking of which, the hero defense I found to be confusing as well. The heroes have their own defense, and when you attack the goblins, when you attack the bad guys, they attack back, unless you kill them right away, which tends to happen with the goblins. So they attack back when you fight them, which means at which point, once they attack back, they'll have their specific modifiers. Some enemies are better against ranged attacks, against magic, against melee, and they'll have their own modifier as far as how they attack you back, and how they deal damage to you, which is modified by your shields. So you attack them, you modify it by their shields, they attack you back in the same instance, modified by your shields. But then when they activate, they don't attack you back using your shields. They just deal straight damage to you. It feels like the time when they are most active, when they have the most agency, when they're doing their own turn. You kind of ignore the whole concept of defense, of your shields, of what you're doing to build yourself up. And then the rest of the time when you attack them, there is this attack back. Again, it just feels a little bit not intuitive for what the game is doing. As far as what I can see others not liking, first of all, you don't really die in this game. That may or may not bother you, but there's no sense of like hero death. When your hero dies, you rest and recover. You lose any free actions that turn, you can still move, and you just take a rest and recover. Tactically choosing to die here so that when you're at 1 health, so you can take a 5 health hit and be efficient when you rest, as opposed to trying to heal yourself and still dying. Tactically choosing to die is a very viable thing you can do in this game, which might thematically break some of the dungeon crawler aspect. You can think of it as being knocked unconscious instead of dying, because obviously you're not dying, but yeah, you can totally die in this game. It's not really a problem. That's not how you lose. And then again, the whole enemies thing of the way they don't really activate the way you would expect them to activate. You find an enemy over there and they don't necessarily activate at the end of their turn. Look, I found the enemy. I'm going to wander off and keep exploring. I'm going to go ahead and wander off and keep exploring. I'll stealth out of their zone or whatever. And now the enemies are just sitting there until you actually get to an enemy activation spot, at which point they go charging across the dungeon using their 5 movement or 2 movement, depends on which goblin you're dealing with, and they'll go ahead and attack you. But they're not activating at the end of every activation, which again might be a break from what you're expecting in terms of a typical dungeon crawler. As far as final thoughts on Tiny Epic Dungeons, before we do final thoughts, let's talk about the expansions. So, we have 2 things. We have Potions and Perils. Potions and Perils is going to give you a few new cards, a few new goblins, a few new bosses, a few minions. The minions are these creatures over there. All of those are nice to have. Again, the bosses provide the most variability, I find, so those are nice to have for sure. The minions are nice to have more stuff, not overly variable, but I'll take it. And then, more importantly, what you primarily have over here is you have a specific location of Mixie's Lab, where you can mix and match these potions. The potions are going to give you a different way to engage with the game, where you can build out these potions, and when you do so, there's a negative effect for doing so, but you'll get a more positive effect when you use them as a free action. These can give you health back, they can restore you to max health, they can give you movement plus a free action, they give you a bunch of extras which are nice to have, although once you run out, you run out. So these are nice to have. I like the variability. I like the potions a lot. That's a nice extra thing in addition to these spells and the gear. So I like the potions. It's a nice little twist, and the fact that something bad happens when you get them, but if something better happens when you use them, it's a nice trade-off. I'll take it. As far as the Stories expansion, the Stories expansion over here is going to add a few things. First of all, we're going to add like 8 new heroes, so if you want more hero variability, you'll get that from over here. My personal favorite of the heroes, if I can find one over here, my personal favorite is I can't find him. He's somewhere here. He's somewhere here. I know he's in here. Here we go. Zhu Xiang, the Pandakin Brewmaster. I love this because this is basically drunken boxing, whatever it is. You will have a stat of 1 for each thing, but you can always lower your health by 1 to get 2 more dice on your stat. So you can always get a 3 die stat for no matter what you're doing, but you have to keep losing health as you do so. Very thematic, easily my favorite character in the whole game. But it adds more characters, also the most interesting. Remember how I said the heroes don't feel that different? I love playing as this hero. He's easily my favorite. But any of these heroes, we have Lyric Gambit. I've never heard of her before. We have Sir Gamelin, but again, some of them are more interesting or different than others. Some of them less so. So you have more hero variety if you want those. More miniatures for the heroes. We have more bosses as well. We have more goblins, more minions, more everything as far as the cards go over here. And then additionally, you have the Epic Dungeon mode. The Epic Dungeon mode is going to give you a 3-level dungeon where you're going to go through it, dealing with 2 bosses along the way. First level is going to take you down to the second level, and then you'll be dealing with 2 bosses past that. It's a longer experience. It gives you a little bit more to engage with. Not my preferred way to play. I feel the game length is appropriate as is, and making it just longer and dragging it out, while it does theoretically give you the option to use your character at max gear for a bit longer, it wasn't something I necessarily felt like I needed from the base game, and so I like the fact that it's there for people to appreciate and engage with if they want. I don't need the epic dungeon. I like the more variety, but I don't need the epic dungeon. As far as final thoughts on Tiny Epic Dungeons. Tiny Epic Dungeons does what many Tiny Epic games have continued to do for me. They have continued to give me enjoyable experiences that are fun, but constantly feel like they are compromising on the larger version, which I don't think is essential for tiny games to begin with. I think it might be essential for tiny epic games. In general, if I play a tiny game, let's say Sprawlopolis, okay? Sprawlopolis, total 18 cards, simple game. I enjoy that for what it is. I think it does a good job. The tiny epic games, and I've played a bunch of them, I have not played all, and I continue to dive into them because they always give me a good experience. I have yet to be scared away from a solid, good game. But they always try to deliver epic experiences, and I find that the combination of the epic experience with what the game is doing, with trying to shove an entire dungeon crawl into a box, usually compromises are made along the way, and I feel that's true here as well. I think Tiny Epic Dungeons is a fine game. It's a 3.5 out of 5 for me. I enjoyed it. There's a lot to recommend here, but it does feel like it compromises on what you can ultimately get out of a full dungeon crawl experience. I would easily recommend this, though, to anyone who's looking for a cheaper dungeon crawl, who's looking for an easier to travel with dungeon crawl. This can go into any suitcase. It can almost, not quite, it can't fit into my pocket, but it can almost, if I really try, it can probably stuff into my sweater. That I can get away with. This is great for traveling. It's great for fitting on a shelf. It's great for those who are looking for a budget dungeon crawl. But I wouldn't recommend this if you're looking for the ultimate dungeon crawl. I think that this compromises on all the things that a full dungeon crawl can give you, but it gives you a solid, a good price, good, shelf space, all of those things, and that continues to be what the Tiny Epic Games has done for me. Good stuff, not necessarily great stuff. Until next time, wait, recommendations. Recommendations, as far as other game recommendations. First of all, this One Deck Dungeon, if you're looking for a more abstracted dungeon crawler, you can check that out. That's going to be a little more card-based, a little less exploring the dungeon. But that's another small box dungeon crawler, but a little more abstracted. And if you're looking for what I would recommend as a good entry point dungeon crawler, that's both affordable and gives you a whole lot more of the epic, Jaws of the Lion. Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion is an excellent dungeon crawler that gives you a ton of strategy, a ton of depth, makes it very accessible at the same time, although it will not fit into my sweater, unfortunately. Although also, some people don't like to call it a dungeon crawler because of how tactical it is compared to like Ameritrash, but that's a different conversation for a different day. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. Hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, and as always, have a good one.